Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Bernier. He is the author of Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament, the Evidence for Early Composition. And what this does is it challenges the consensus view on the late dating of the Gospels, and also a little bit on the dating of Paul, so it puts Paul just a little bit earlier, but it puts the Gospels a bit earlier than the consensus dating does. Mark is typically dated to around 70, Matthew 80, Luke 90, John 100, or closer to or almost at the same time as Luke. But Dr. Bernier puts the Gospels largely before 70 and puts John on 70. Today he's going to be talking about what led him to that conclusion. So, Dr. Bernier, tell us, what led you to the thought process of rethinking the dates of the New Testament in favor of early composition?
So it actually was I didn't set out to argue for early composition. This book started really as notes for my comprehensive exams for my doctorate. If you do a doctorate in North America, you have to do a series of examinations, usually in your second or third year, that look at a wide range of areas in your field. And so I just sat down when I was studying for mine and intended to spend an afternoon just listing out the dates of when the New Testament books were written, and quickly realized that it wasn't as straightforward as something you could do in an afternoon, and that eventually snowballed into a larger into a book length project. And it was through that project that I eventually came to the conclusion that the Gospels were probably a bit earlier than when we usually date them. For me, the big issue for me is whether or not, and I think it is the key issue, whether or not the Gospels know the destruction of the temple in 70. I think Matthew and Mark very clearly are unaware of that destruction. I think Luke could be aware, John could be aware, but not necessarily. And once you dispense with that, the major argument for a post-70 date for all of them is significantly undermined. So that's really, for me, that was the real turning point. Thank you.
Scholars will often argue that, well, Mark 13 seems to clearly describe the fall of the temple. No stone shall be left upon the other. Mm-hmm. But when you look at that, what do you see that they don't see?
Well, I think it clearly does see that the Gospels do clearly have some sense that the temple might be destroyed. But one thing that's very clear is they never actually say it has been destroyed. The examples you give are prophecy. And you don't have to believe in supernatural prophecies to recognize that in a tradition where the temple had been destroyed before, it was thinkable that it could happen again. And in fact, most of the imagery that we see in the Gospels about the destruction of the temple is connected either with the destruction of the first temple or the desolation of the second temple during the Maccabean era, 2 centuries before, give or take, before Jesus. So they're drawing upon scriptural and traditional material. I think that's completely plausible that in the decades running up to the first Jewish war, as things are starting to get a little dicey in Judea, people are starting to think maybe this could happen again. In fact, Josephus tells us that a prophet came several years before the destruction of the temple and prophesied its destruction. So it's not unthinkable. I also think there's particular details that, especially in Matthew and Luke, or especially in Matthew and Mark, seem a little bit out of place in the post-70 period. One of the big things is both Matthew and Mark clearly seem to think that Jesus will return, that there'll be some sort of dramatic, climactic turn of the age, the return of Jesus, the return of the eschaton, something like that at the time the destruction of the temple happens. It's a lot harder for me to imagine that they think that after 70 than before, because that doesn't seem to happen in 70. The world doesn't seem to come to an end in 70. Jesus doesn't come on a cloud, all these sort of eschatological things that are predicted. In Matthew, you certainly have this idea that some of Jesus talks about some of those who are listening to him will live until till this the eschaton, the return of Jesus. So there seems to be some sense that this is very early, and I think more plausibly pre-70 than post-70.
So in this case, you think that the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and Luke are being written, or at least Mark and Matthew are being written around the same time as Paul's letters, Paul's authentic letters?
I think Mark probably predates the letters.
Okay.
Matthew is probably around the same time as the letters. Probably, the majority of the letters date to the 50s of the Common Era. I think Matthew most likely does as well. Mark, I think, dates to the 40s.
Why do you think that Mark dates to the 40s? What indicates that to you?
So I see, I build upon the work of James Crossley, and who argues very strongly that if you look at Mark really doesn't seem to be overly concerned with the question of Torah observance, whether or not Christians should remain, particularly Gentiles, whether or not followers of Jesus should be following Torah. This becomes a major concern for Matthew and Luke, and we know, there's good reason historically to think that this concern is a result of actively recruiting non-Jewish persons, and that seems to start from about the mid-40s, from the 40s on, and then the issue becomes very prominent, it seems, by the late 40s, early 50s. So it makes a lot more sense to me that Mark is written before that controversy. He doesn't address it because the controversy hasn't erupted yet. I think it makes much more sense to me. Whereas Matthew and Luke, they're addressing it because the controversy has erupted, and so they're more cognizant of that question. That really comes down to me, that I think people aren't addressing questions before they're asked, and I don't see Mark addressing that question. So I think it's more likely than not he's writing before it was asked.
When you look at the chronology of Paul's letters, and in the book you talk about the early, the middle chronologies regarding the dating of Paul, and you talk about some scholars put Paul's letters in the late 50s, mid 50s, or early 50s.
Yeah.
You seem to be putting them almost. Yeah, I know you said that you put Mark before Paul. Do you think Paul is already writing his letters not long after Mark is written, say late 40s, like 48 to 50, early 50s?
I mean, Paul is where the stakes in terms of chronological questions are among the lowest, in that virtually everyone would agree that Paul wrote the bulk of his letters in the 50s. I don't think there's any real disagreement on that. So the disagreement tends to be in the matter of 4 or 5 years, as opposed to the Gospels. We are dealing sometimes with upwards of a century of disagreements. But I do think, there's one of the major disagreements turns upon Galatians. Is Galatians towards the end of the 50s? Is it, or is it as early as the late 40s? I think Galatians is earlier. I think it dates to the later 40s, maybe the early 50s. But the truth is that those stakes are relatively low. The difference between Galatians in 48 versus Galatians in 57 are relatively minor compared to, Acts in 42 or Mark in 42 versus Mark in 70. That's a much different, it's a more significant difference.
When you look at Mark 13 and you look at it from the standpoint that, okay, the Jews they already know, as you just mentioned earlier, that the first temple was destroyed. So it wasn't inconceivable to them that the second temple would probably be destroyed in the future. And no need for thinking like a theologian, supernatural stuff, or any of that for any of that to make sense. What do you think gave Mark the idea that the temple will be destroyed? Does perhaps Jesus' crucifixion, the Samaritan uprising, the feudus incident in the 40s? Did early rebellions give him an indication of that?
I think that's possible. I mean, often connection is made to Caligula, the Emperor Caligula, defiling the temple around 40, where he insists upon a statue of himself being put up. That this could be the sort of the moment where these sort of prophecies become generated. That would fit with the language of desolation and abomination. Mark talks about uses this language drawn from earlier tradition that when you see the abomination of desolation set up where it's not supposed to be, that fits very well with something being erected in a temple that devout Jewish people would find objectionable. I'm sympathetic to those sort of ideas that it has to do with these sort of events in the 30s and 40s. I'm not as quick as some to want to pin these prophecies to a very particular event. They're actually, I think the prophecies are general enough that they could have been generated by all sorts of events that happened in the decades running up to 70s, even events that we don't know about, just a general climate. So I'm sympathetic to the idea of connecting with Caligula, that sort of interpretation, but I wouldn't want to go too far down. I wouldn't want to be too insistent upon it. But I think certainly, it's a traumatic period in Jewish history. It's building up to a far more traumatic period in the next few decades. So that people are fearing for the temple is entirely plausible to me. Thank you.
You talk about that Mark wasn't aware of a particular controversy, and he must have therefore logically have written before the controversy occurred. Was Matthew aware of the controversy that you were talking about?
So I think, I think Mark's relative silence on this issue is significant precisely because we see Matthew and Luke beginning to address it. They're beginning to address questions about Torah observance in a way that we don't see in Mark. So I think that this is, that fits very well to me on the sort of a historical trajectory, that one dates before the emergence of that debate as a major issue, the other two afterwards. I think that fits very well. I would say they're definitely, Mark and Luke are both much more aware of the question of Gentile inclusion, of what that means for Torah. I think Mark is most plausibly read at a time when those issues just really haven't occurred to anyone because everyone's Jewish anyway. So they just follow Torah. Yeah.
When Paul mentions a gospel, because Paul often talks about something being in a gospel, or he keeps quoting saying it is written, it is written, it is written, and a lot of the time it's not it is written statements aren't in the Old Testament. Do you think he's quoting a gospel, or do you think he even knows about the Gospel of Mark at this stage?
I don't think there's any instance where we can point and say he definitely knows the Gospel of Mark or definitely knows the Gospel of Matthew. There is one very interesting text in First Timothy, which quotes from a writing, says explicitly as the scripture says, then quotes Deuteronomy, and also a fragment that's a fragmentary sentence that's a sentence that's only found and is found verbatim in the Gospel of Luke. But of course, First Timothy is generally thought to be not by Paul, so that's, what do we do with that? That's but it's still a very interesting passage. In general, though, I think that I'd be very reluctant to say that Paul definitely knows any of our known gospel texts. Conversely, trying to prove a negative, trying to prove that he doesn't know it is extremely difficult. So I wouldn't say that he doesn't. I would say we have to probably be agnostic on that.
And when would you date the other letters, the general letters, First, Second, 3 John, the letter of James, the letter of Jude? Is it all also around the same time too?
You're asking me to remember what I did. I would say probably James. I would say probably dates around the same time as Paul's letters, maybe a little bit earlier. Hebrews, I would date between about 50 and 70. First, Second Peter, Jude, 1, 2, 3 John. Those are the really difficult texts to get into because they give us so little information in terms of when they might be situated. So ultimately, I think they have to. I think they're probably first century texts, probably written by the end of the first century. I'm most confident about First Peter being an actual Petrine writing actually by Peter. In which case, it would date before the late 60s when Peter likely dies. But other than that, it's really hard to say with those texts where they date.
I want to go back to the Gospel of Luke for a moment. You were bringing up, you bring up in your book that you heavily disagree with the scholars that came to the conclusion that the Gospel of Luke is familiar with the works of Josephus.
Mm-hmm.
You think that Luke is significantly earlier than Josephus. You put it before AD 70. If I remember correctly, you put it around, I think, 50 to 60, somewhere in that area.
I would say it's probably written in the late 50s.
Okay.
But certainly before about 60. Yeah.
What do you make of the supposed parallels between Luke and Josephus that led some of these scholars to conclude that Luke made use of Josephus?
Mm-hmm. So that's actually really interesting. It was very popular in the 19th century to connect Luke and Josephus, to see them as Luke using Josephus. Then it was almost entirely abandoned for the 20th century, and then just in the last 20 years or so has been taken up again. I think it's in the category of possible, but not very likely. I mean, the sort of places one has to look to establish these arguments are precisely places where Luke and Josephus disagree, very clearly. It's, much is made of the fact that Luke and Josephus both name 3 rebels, Judas, Photius, and the Egyptian. But we also know that Luke puts them in a different chronological order than Josephus. So, you have to, at the same time, what you have to do if you want to explain why that Luke is using Josephus, you have to explain how he's using Josephus, but getting Josephus wrong, and the situations multiply. In fact, for much of the history of scholarship, Luke's disagreements with Josephus have been held up as evidence at times of Luke's historical inaccuracy. So, there's coincidences, but there's also a lot of differences. And I think that exact combination is best explained if we just imagine that Luke and Josephus have things in common simply because they're writing about the same period in history. They're both writing about, Judea in the early, in the decades running up to 70, the century or so before 70. So they both are going to have things in common. Yeah. that way you explain the differences. They're drawing upon different sources. They're not actually one. Neither is reading the other. It's actually become very interesting in the last 5 years, last 3 or 4 years. People have tried to flip this around and say that Josephus is using Luke. I think that's equally wrong, but I think it does speak to the fact that there's really very few. There's really nothing we can point at that can say clearly this is clearly a quotation from Josephus, very clearly. Yeah, so I think it's not impossible, but I think it's far from strong.
What do you think of the reverse argument that Josephus used Luke?
I don't think it. Again, I would say it's not impossible. I don't see any passage that makes it clear to me that Josephus does know Luke. I know that there's been some arguments that Josephus, that his account of Jesus is very clearly drawing upon Luke, even on some verbal parallels. Again, I'll grant it's possible, but I just don't see enough similarities to establish source. One as a source for the other. I think it's generally speaking, we tend to want to see a really high degree of verbatim agreement before we will see one text as a source for another, and that just lacks in Luke Josephus connection in either direction.
Remember that you mentioned in the book that you date the letter of Clement, First Clement. I think it was around. I think you were placing it around 64.
Somewhere
like
between,
that?
Yeah, somewhere I think between 64 and 68. I think is most likely. After it knows the deaths of Peter and Paul, so it has to be after Peter and Paul were probably both alive as late as 64. I think it knows the destruction of. I think it's not. Or sorry, I don't think it knows the destruction of the temple. I think it assumes the temple was still standing. So I should say actually somewhere between 64 and about 70 is where I think it makes the most sense.
A lot of. Oh, go ahead.
Please. No, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, a lot of scholars, as you are aware, they tend to date First Clement to the 90s.
Yep.
They tend to say, well, actually, it seems to be referring to a particular persecution as having long passed, and now he's referring to another one, and that's their argument that he wrote very late. But what makes you think it was written in the 60s? Because I know there are some other scholars that also place it in a pre-70 era.
Yeah. So again, I think it clearly knows that it very clearly knows that Peter and Paul are dead, and I think it. I think when it talks about the temple cult, it talks about it in my mind in a way that makes most sense that the temple is still standing. I think also the issue of persecution, I think, is the persecution. It's often been connected with Nero's persecution. It's also been connected with Domitian's persecution. I don't think the discussions of hardships in Clement are specific enough to connect with any known course of persecution. I don't think there was a Domitian persecution in the 90s. I think that's basically a production of modern historiography. So, so on those two bases, I don't think we can connect it with a particular course of persecution the way, say, J.B. Lightfoot wanted to do in the 19th century, or Robinson wanted to do in the 20th. So, I think we're that attempt to connect with persecution is a fruitless avenue, and I think we're far better off to focus upon the awareness of the deaths of Peter and Paul, and what might be going on with the temple.
About the letter to the Hebrews, I know that the content in the letter to the Hebrews is a bit similar to First Clement in the sense that they both describe Jesus in very similar ways, Jesus being the high priest in heaven and on earth, even to the point in which Origen of Alexandria, at one point said either Clement or Luke wrote Hebrews when he wrote about that. When do you date Hebrews to around the same time as Clement, or do you think Hebrews is earlier and Clement might be keying off Hebrews?
I think it's extremely likely that First Clement knows knows Hebrews, and so I think Hebrews has to predate Clement, and conversely, First Clement has to post-date Hebrews. I think Hebrews is, in my mind, very clearly a pre-70 work. I think when it talks about the temple, it seems to assume that the temple still stands. I think that's absolutely central to its rhetoric, and especially chapter 10. So I think I would date Hebrews sometime, probably not much earlier than 50, because it refers to Timothy, our brother Timothy, and Timothy doesn't seem to be a Christian leader before about 50. But I think no later than 70, because it seems to assume the destruction of the temple. So that allows easily 15 years that Hebrews could have been written before the earliest date I think is plausible for First Clement. So I think it fits together quite well, actually.
Since you placed the synoptic gospel significantly earlier, including John, do you think that there is more historical reliability in the gospels with this early dating? And the reason I ask this is because a lot of scholars will say, well, the gospels are very late, and they seem to question the gospels heavily about, okay, how much of it is historical, how much of it is fiction, or somewhere between mythology and fiction and history, something like that. What's your take on that?
So I want to be careful with what I say here, because I do think that the Gospels contain more usable historical information, especially on Jesus' life, than many scholars would think. I think it generally, at the very least, the general outlines of Jesus' life are basically the way the Gospels lay them out. I think that the general, I think for instance, John's chronology of, say, a 2 to 3 year ministry, I think, is very strong. I think we need to take seriously when Luke says that John the Baptist began his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius. But I want to be very clear that I don't think that because of when I date the Gospels. I think of that. I think that on an independent basis. So to me, there's really two independent questions. I can imagine a gospel that is very early and yet completely wrong because the writer is ill-informed, not trustworthy, whatever the case is. And I can imagine a gospel that's very late, but is relying upon very early sources and very reliable sources, and is extremely accurate. So to me, those are independent variables. But I do, yes, think that the Gospels are fairly good, fairly reliable texts for historical reconstructions.
What do you think about the two document hypothesis and the idea that Luke and Matthew are ignorant of each other, and they both independently copied Mark, and the hypothetical Q document? There's also the modified two document hypothesis, like that states Mark knew Q, and there are others that will say, well, Luke actually used Matthew and Mark. Matthew used Mark, and Matthew used Q as well. Luke also used Q. They're all very familiar with that document. What do you think of it? Do you think there was a Q document? Because I know there's scholars that also hold the Ferrer hypothesis that there was no Q document.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to the Ferrer hypothesis, which says that Mark wrote first, Matthew used Mark, Luke used both. But I, as much as possible, tried to bracket those issues out of this book. I didn't want to, as much as possible, I didn't want to ground what I was doing in source criticism, simply because source criticism, as you say, there's so many different hypotheses out there that to get into the weeds of all of them would have required another book, and all of them are sufficiently underdetermined that it didn't feel right to me to build a whole lot upon them. Having said that, I think Mark in priority, that Mark wrote first, is a very strong position. I think it's hard to assail that at this point. And I also think, a number of readers have pointed out that I didn't give enough room to the possibility that that Matthew wrote last, that Mark wrote first, then Luke, then Matthew. So reversing the order of Matthew and Luke from the far hypothesis. And that's a fair criticism. I didn't give that enough attention in the book. But I think overall source criticism is not as much of an answer as we often assume it will be for these sort of questions.
I have interviewed scholars in the past that hold the Mafia and posteriority hypothesis, that Mark's first, Luke
Yeah.
next, and Matthew used both.
Yeah.
And one of them, Professor Adam Chesky, puts a lot of emphasis on Matthew's use of acts.
Yeah.
He wrote a whole book on that, about Matthew's reworking of Luke and especially acts. When you think about that idea, I know that you didn't concentrate on the synoptic problem too much in the book, but when you look at it, could you briefly, in a brief summary, describe how do you react to the idea of Matthew's of Luke instead of the Farrer position?
I think it's plausible. I mean, I think I do find the Farrer hypothesis more compelling for a number of reasons. But I do think Mafian posteriority is strong enough and seems to be gaining enough in prominent names supporting it, and very respected names supporting it, that I think it probably needs to be considered alongside Q and Farrer as one of the major possibilities that are out there now. And so for me, the big thing is Luke is demonstrably aware of at least two other gospel texts. If we assume Farrer hypothesis, then that's easy to explain. It's Mark and Matthew. If we assume any other hypothesis, then we have to come up with hypothetical texts. And I just don't know if hypothetical texts are necessary. And so to me, we can, Farrer hypothesis still seems to me the most economical explanation of the data.
What do you mean by the Neronian non-error in Revelation 13?
Okay. That's okay. So often in scholarship over the last, say, 2 centuries, there's been this huge focus on Domitian, and the idea that there was persecution of the Christians under Domitian towards the end of his reign in the 90s. I think more recent work has shown that persecution is, at the very least, exaggerated, if not non-existent. I lean towards it being non-existent. So I refer in my text to the Domitianic era, this idea that the error being the existence of this Domitianic persecution. And then I also refer to a Neronian error that John A.T. Robinson, who wrote a book arguing very similar to mine about 50 years ago, he sees Nero everywhere. Every persecution that he sees in the New Testament, it seems, he wants to see it be be the Neronian persecution. And I think he's wrong on that. So I referred to a Neronian error. The one exception is, I think, Revelation very clearly assumes the Neronian persecution, that it knows about Nero significantly mistreating Christians in at least Rome during the mid-60s. And I think that's the background for Revelation, and it's best understood in that background.
So you think that, if I'm understanding this correctly, you think that Revelation was being written at the same time when Emperor Nero was reigning, or close to 70, around the same time as John,
I
And
think, sorry.
okay, I was just going to finish real fast and say, so it's not writing too far off retrospectively of the events it's talking about, the whole Antichrist thing, the
Mhm.
gematria, uh, Nero's gematria being 666, which many scholars have noted is the same as the 666 and the Mark of the Beast and Revelation.
Yeah, I think I think um, I think Revelation is aware of Nero's death, so it's after mid 68, because he talks about how the beast will suffer a mortal wound, or will seem to suffer a mortal wound, but then be resurrected. I think that this makes a lot of sense in the post-Neronian era, where there was an expectation that, amongst many, that Nero would return um, from the dead, or that he was only supposed, or he never actually died. That he was, that he had actually survived the wound. um, so I think it makes most sense if it's written after mid 68. I think conversely, Revelation, I think, supposes the existence of the temple, and so I think it has to be written in that very narrow space of time between Nero's death in 68 and the destruction of the temple in 70.
Do you think that the author of Revelation is the same one that wrote John? Because there are some early church fathers that yes, they are. Later ones that say no, they're not. What do you think?
I'm agnostic on that. I think the um, the language is very different, and so that's the major argument against them being the same by the same person. Um, I think authors can often use very different language for very different uh, contexts. So I think, I only would want to press that so far. There are echoes of John's gospel in Revelation. Some of the same, some of the Christology, my mind echoes. So I think I would put the possibility that they're the same author. I put that in the possibility category. I'm probably at the when you really get down to it, would probably say they're probably different authors, but I wouldn't want to push that too far.
You also mentioned that you date the Gospel of John to 8070 due to, I think you said synchronization.
Mhm.
Could you
Yeah, I
describe
think it.
that?
So I think in John 5, he talks about how there are um, talks about this pool, the pool of Bethesda, and he talks about it as something that he uses the present tense. Um, I think it's been shown well that this doesn't fit with it being a historical present. He talks about the um, the porticles that are around it. As far as you know, this area was completely destroyed in 70. So this passage to me makes a lot more sense before 70. Now I will say very clearly, though, the four gospels, I think John is the one that's most plausibly post 70. The evidence for a pre 70 text in John, I think, is the weakest. I still ultimately think it's strong enough to say 70 before 70 is more probable than after 70, but it's certainly the one that would surprise me least if it was a post 70 text.
What do you think about the source criticism involving the Gospel of John? Like, some people say, well, the Gospel of John is an independent eyewitness document. Some even claim it may not even be dependent on the synoptics at all, or it barely knows them. But what do you think about that?
Um, I generally tend to follow where my colleagues in source criticism will go, because source criticism is such a highly specialized discipline, and they have incredibly specialized knowledge that I haven't developed to the same extent they have in terms of the relationship between the texts. And it seems right now that source critics are leaning more and more towards Paul or towards John, knowing at least Mark. And I think there's really good reason for that. I would tend to think that that's makes a lot of sense, that John knows one or more of the synoptics. I think the evidence is ambiguous enough that I wouldn't necessarily insist upon it, but I think it's, I think that's where people are leaning these days, and I think it does make a lot of sense.
When would you date the Didache in this whole situation? I know that there's a lot of scholarship on the Didache saying it's been redacted multiple times. Some will even say, well, the Gospels are familiar with the Didache with different versions of it. And then the final form of it came afterwards. What are your thoughts?
So, the Didache is very frustrating to work with, because all we have for the Didache is an 11th century text, an 11th century manuscript that's probably incomplete. It ends where it breaks off at the end of the text is probably not where the text ended. So we probably don't even have a complete copy of the Didache, and that makes it very difficult to figure out exactly anything to do with its history. So I ended up ultimately concluding that it was somewhere between about 50 and 120-ish. I don't think you can get much more precise than that with a high degree of confidence. Having said that, I do tend to think it seems to be, in my mind, dealing with a lot of the issues that we see very prominent around the time of Paul, and dealing with questions about Torah observance, questions of Paul has to deal with it, questions about funding apostles, funding prophets, the emphasis upon prophets. As far as we know, Christian, the role of prophet as a Christian leader seems to drop off significantly after the first generation or two. After Paul, it seems to not be anywhere near as prominent. So, even Paul seems to have some ambivalence towards the role of prophet. So, I would probably incline to dating it to the earlier part of that period, towards 50 or 60, but I would certainly acknowledge that, if the Didache wasn't finished until well into the 2nd century, that wouldn't surprise me either. So.
I know that there are also some scholars that will say that the Gospel of John can date to multiple periods simultaneously, because they think that John, like the Didache, has multiple layers of written material redactions. Do you think John was written all at once by a single author, or do you agree with the assessment that it was redacted over a couple of decades or so?
I think the evidence for redaction is not as strong as we often assume. It tends to be things like people correctly observe that the last chapter 21, is an epilogue, and that the John 20 the end of John 20 could have served as an end for the gospel, and that's absolutely true. But it's a huge leap from that to say that it ever did. We have no evidence that it ever did. We don't know. We have no evidence that John ever existed apart from John 21. John 21 could be an epilogue that was original to the text. There's no reason that it couldn't be. Often it's assumed, not as much now, but it certainly was a century ago, that the first 18 verses of John, with the hymn to the Logos, the praise of the word, all this stuff, are a subsequent addition to the text. Again, and that may have been a pre-existing text that was added, that was incorporating the text. Again, that's possible, but I don't see anything that makes it necessary, and I don't see how it explains anything that I can't explain otherwise. I think the text as it stands, I think, is entirely intelligible as something that was written basically within a very relatively short period of time. But having said that, I can't rule out redaction. There could be multiple redactions going on. I don't think the evidence is as strong as we often have come to assume it is.
Which of the 27 books in the New Testament do you think came at the very last, and when would you date it?
I want to qualify this. Aside from the texts I already mentioned, first, second, especially Second Peter, First, Second, Third John, Jude, where I think they could date into the 2nd century. If I bracket out those texts, I would probably say Revelation in the late 60s, maybe, and maybe John around the same time. But I would also acknowledge Second Peter, Jude, especially 2 and 3, but also 1 John, could very plausibly date later. And I'm bracketing those out really just because I'm really not sure exactly a more precise date to give on them. So,
What is your position on the Gospels' authorship? Do you think they are anonymous? I know that there are scholars that do think that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John really did write Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. What is your position on that?
I think with Mark and Luke, I think very good reason to think that I'll go one in each gospel at a time. I think Matthew, I'm inclined to think was not written by Matthew, although Matthew may have had a hand in it. But I think the ultimate text that we have, is probably not Matthew's production. We do have some references to an early Hebrew or Aramaic gospel that's associated with Matthew. I think he may have been involved in some of the early Semitic material, Aramaic and Hebrew material that led to the gospel. But I think the Greek gospel as we have it probably is not. He's probably not the main composer. Mark, I think very clearly, I'm very happy to say that Mark wrote Mark, although I would have some question about exactly how that Mark relates to all the different Marks mentioned in the New Testament. I'm not sure he's the same. I'm not sure that we can conflate on everyone referred to as Mark into a single person. Luke, I'm absolutely confident Luke was written by, and Acts was written by Luke the physician that we know from Colossians. And John, I think someone named John wrote the Gospel of John, whether that's John son of Zebedee, John the Elder that we know of from Eusebius's writings as a follower of Jesus, or some other John who's that's otherwise unknown. I think that's an open question, but I do think someone named John probably did write the Gospel of John.
Do you think that, kind of going back to the question earlier of the reverse of the idea of Luke's dependence on Josephus, with on the reverse of it, Josephus's supposed dependence on Luke, do you think that Josephus was familiar with the New Testament? Do you think he actually knew about the New Testament?
I would say if he does, he gives very little indication of it. My guess is the New Testament probably was not much known beyond Christian circles into the 2nd century. I mean, we have to go relatively late into the 2nd century before we see other groups taking much notice of the New Testament. We get some offhand references, but I think this wasn't a significant body of literature. The body of literature wasn't particularly significant to people who didn't have some sort of dedication to Jesus for quite some time, I think.
Final question. When you look at the very first writings, like you get, in the order that you put them, you got Mark, and then you got Paul starting to write after Mark, and Matthew and Luke are writing around the same time as Paul, and then John and Revelation are being written after Paul, and as well as including First Clement, because First Clement mentions his death and all. When after the crucifixion of Jesus, and Mark's writing about 10 years afterwards from your timeline, or maybe slightly over 10 years. How do you think Mark was reacting? Like, I guess the question I'm asking is, aside from the crucifixion, what do you think caused him to write his gospel?
That's a really good question. Well, traditionally, and by traditionally I mean second century writers, Clement of Alexandria, for instance, says that Mark wrote in Rome at the behest of the Roman Christians because Peter had been teaching there. Peter had left, and they wanted a copy of what Peter had been teaching. And we see this in Papias, a similar sort of argument, similar sort of report that he copied down that Mark copied down what Peter had taught. I think probably the early Gospels were probably written in large part just because people wanted some sort of record of what Jesus had done. I think it may be connected with, I think, even with the Eucharistic words, this idea that, if early Christian masses already had this language of do this in remembrance of me, I think it would be a very logical thing for people to then say, well, what are we supposed to remember? What did Jesus do? What did he say? So these questions came very logically out of this early emphasis upon memory. So, I think really it probably just comes down to people wanting to know more about Jesus, and they were already convinced that he was their Lord, their Savior, all this language. Now they wanted to know what that meant and who this person is that they were following.
Well, thanks for joining me today, and I thank everybody else in the live chat for their participation and their interactions with one another. And I will see all of you later. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.